Margaret Holloway had built her empire from nothing. At 52, she was the CEO of Holloway Industries, a company worth $4 billion, with offices in 12 countries and over 30,000 employees under her name. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of small moments to change lives, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness True Stories. Also, tell us in the comments where in the world are you watching from. She was the kind of woman who arrived at work before sunrise and left long after midnight. She wore her ambition like armor, and she had very little patience for anything that slowed her down. On a Tuesday morning in November, the universe decided it was finally time to teach her something she had never learned in any boardroom. She had just stepped into the private elevator of her 40-story headquarters, coffee in one hand and phone in the other, barking orders to her assistant through her earpiece, when a man in grey overalls stepped in just before the doors closed. She barely glanced at him. He was carrying a toolbox and wearing a faded name badge that read Danny. He smelled of machine oil and burnt wire. Margaret pressed the button for the 40th floor without offering so much as a nod in his direction. 3 seconds later, the elevator shuddered violently. The lights flickered and everything went completely still. The elevator had stopped between the 18th and 19th floors. Margaret immediately pressed the emergency button with sharp, repeated jabs. Nothing happened. She pulled out her phone and found she had no signal. For the first time in years, Margaret Holloway had no control over her situation. She exhaled sharply and looked at Danny, who was already setting down his toolbox, calmly, and opening it without any visible sign of panic. "You know how to fix this?" she asked, her voice carrying its usual edge of authority. Danny looked up and gave her a small, steady smile. "Let me take a look," he said simply. He opened the panel on the side wall of the elevator with a small key from his belt, studied the wires and circuitry inside with quiet focus, and then did something. It took him exactly 60 seconds. The lights stabilized. The elevator hummed softly and then began to move again. Margaret stared at him. "How did you do that?" she asked, and for the first time in the conversation, there was something different in her voice. The sharpness was still there, but underneath it was something unfamiliar, genuine curiosity. Danny closed the panel and picked up his toolbox. "Loose relay switch," he said. "It happens sometimes when the building gets cold." "The metal contracts. I've fixed this elevator 4 times this year." Margaret studied him properly for the first time. He was around her age, maybe a few years older, with calloused hands and tired eyes that held a quiet kind of dignity. "You've been maintaining this elevator for how long?" she asked. 11 years, Danny said. "I've been with the building since before your company moved in." The elevator reached the 40th floor and the doors opened. Margaret stood still for a moment, which was something she almost never did. She was thinking.
"Come with me," she said.
Danny looked surprised, but followed her into the executive suite. Her assistant nearly dropped her tablet when she saw the man in overalls walking beside. The CEO. Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Danny, who sat a little uncomfortably in the expensive chair across from her desk. "Tell me about your work," she said. And so Danny talked. He talked about how he had flagged safety issues in the building's elevator system 3 times over the past 2 years in written reports sent to the maintenance department. He talked about how those reports had been acknowledged with automated responses and then apparently forgotten. He talked about how 2 of the smaller service elevators on the lower floors had been showing signs of serious wear that nobody above him seemed to care about. He talked and Margaret listened, truly listened, without her phone, without interrupting, without looking at the clock. When he finished, her expression was unreadable. She picked up her phone, made 1 call, and asked her head of building operations to come to her office immediately. When the man arrived and saw Danny sitting there, his face went pale. Margaret placed Danny's 3 previous reports on the desk between them. "These were filed." "They were not acted upon," she said quietly, which was somehow more frightening than if she had shouted. "I want every safety concern in this building reviewed and addressed." Within 30 days. I want Danny leading that review, and I want him compensated appropriately for the expertise. This company has been taken for granted for 11 years. The operations manager nodded repeatedly and left quickly. Danny sat very still. Why? He asked. Margaret looked at him, and something in her face softened in a way that surprised even herself. Because 60 seconds of your skill just saved my life, she said. And I've been in this building for 7 years without ever learning your name. Danny was promoted to head of building safety that month. The 2 smaller elevators were repaired within 2 weeks. Margaret began walking through different departments every Friday morning, not to inspect, but to listen. She said later in an interview that being trapped in an elevator for 4 minutes taught her something that $4 billion never had, that the most important people in any organization are often the ones you walk past without looking up. Danny still fixes things with quiet hands and steady focus, but now his reports go directly to the top, and they are never ignored. Sometimes the smallest rooms hold the biggest lessons, and sometimes it only takes 60 seconds for the right person to change everything. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel Kindness. True Stories, where every story reminds us that real greatness lives in everyday people. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that matter.